Day 26 is now in the bag in the Karen Read trial, and today was a very entertaining day, at least for me, and I think even for the layman. Watching Alan Jackson cross-examine Trooper Paul was a clinic. It was a clinic in how to cross-examine these type of witnesses, and he just did a great job. Now, before you jump onto me and say, oh, you're just a free Karen Read guy, that's not what we do here. What we do here is we report, we recap, I give you my analysis, and of course, part of that is telling you whether a lawyer is doing an effective job or not, whether he could have done something better, or if he's doing something not so great, or if there's some weaknesses in his arguments, or if there's arguments to be made both ways. That's what we do here. So that's part of what we're doing. It doesn't mean I'm taking one side over the next. So some people have been saying on some of my other videos, oh, you're a free Karen Read guy, and some people have been saying that I'm biased towards the prosecution. And of course, for all of you that are honest and followers of this channel, you already know that we're just subjective here. We're just reporting, we're giving you the analysis that a trial lawyer, how a trial lawyer looks at what's going on in this case. And that's all I'm doing here, and that's what we're going to continue to do. All right. So before jumping into the analysis today on the cross-examination for Trooper Paul and some other witnesses that came in the end of the day, some text messages from Karen Read, please, if you haven't yet, subscribe, like, join the Brother Counsel sidebar membership, and these are all easy ways to support the channel. All right, let's move on to what happened today. So we have Trooper Paul, who was on the stand. He is the reconstructionist. Now, as I mentioned in my last video, I felt, this is my feeling of watching this trial, my feeling is that so far, for the Commonwealth, Trooper Paul was the strongest witness. And some people are saying, well, he didn't testify well, he is not such a great witness, I don't even know why you're thinking that he's the greatest witness. And the reason, as a lawyer, I'm looking at this and I'm saying he is the strongest witness is because he's the first person who's putting Karen Read in the car, and saying exactly what she's doing to commit this murder. He's the one saying she went up 60 feet, she threw the car into reverse, she gunned it, hit 24.2 miles per hour, then hit a pedestrian who was John O'Keefe and killed him. That's essentially what he testified to. Now, it was all through this science and expert opinions, what he's saying, but he's the first one who's actually saying what Karen Read actually did this night. So that's why I thought he was the strongest witness. When you have some of the science and some of the data backing your opinion up, it comes across as much stronger than just a lay witness saying their opinion about something. So that's why I felt he was so far the Commonwealth's strongest witness, at least in pointing the finger directly at Karen Read and saying exactly how she committed this murder. Now, just to finish off the direct examination, what Mr. Lally did today, he just said, okay, let's just go over it. Essentially, what he's testifying is that Karen Read's SUV hit John O'Keefe at 12:45 in the morning. It went 62 feet at 24.2 miles per hour. He was projected forward and to the left, which is how he ended up rolling or flying across the air, or however he landed by that area in the lawn where he was found. And that was his testimony. Okay, now cross-examination begins. And the first thing that Alan Jackson, first thing that he establishes is that Trooper Paul, you don't have any degrees in math, in physics, in biomechanics, in engineering, in kinematics. These are all specialties. And let me tell you something. In my own cases that I've had, there's a lot of times you have biomechanical engineers, and these people are real experts. You're not going to catch them on some of the questions that Alan Jackson was able to catch Trooper Paul on, because these people really know the science, they really know the math, and you're not going to catch them. So what happened today was only the reason why Alan Jackson was able to conduct a cross-examination like he did is because he knew that Trooper Paul was not as educated as a regular biomechanical engineer or other type of engineer who sometimes testifies in reconstruction. And I've had that in my cases, and it's a nightmare to try to cross-examine some of these people because they're really smart, and you can't catch them on the science. It's not going to work. You have to poke holes other ways. Anyway, so the first thing he establishes, and the jury hears this, he's no degrees in math, physics, okay, science. He took a course. And yeah, it was a hard course, and they weeded out a lot of people, and he was one of the few people that actually was able to get through the course and pass through the course, and now he's considered some sort of reconstructionist expert in the Massachusetts State Police. But make no mistake about this, he does not have any degree in science. The highest he has is an associate's degree, right? So right away, it takes away some of his credibility with the jury. So that's the first thing Alan Jackson wanted to establish. And then he started asking him certain questions. So, for example, he asked him, what's the difference between constrained and unconstrained motion? And he answered he doesn't know. And then he said, also, the fact that you're saying that the car slowed down, and part of the reason, right, he's saying that, that Trooper Paul is saying on the stand that it's consistent with what happened. The data is consistent with a pedestrian strike. The reason why he's saying that is, one of the reasons is that the car slowed down. So it was going, according to the data, it was going 24.2 miles per hour backwards. And then it slowed down by a half a mile per hour. And at the same time, the steering wheel changed from right to left, which is all consistent with a pedestrian strike. Well, Alan Jackson pointed out, it's also consistent with other types of things that can be happening in the vehicle, like hitting a curb or some other issues that you're having with the car when it doesn't have to mean a pedestrian strike, right? Isn't that a possibility? And then he also pointed out that Trooper Paul, a lot of his assessment was based on how he measured that the furthest piece of plastic, which is from the broken taillight, right, is the furthest piece of plastic from John O'Keefe's final resting place. He used that as part of his calculation in determining how this accident happened, right? So he pointed out, hold on a second, there's also a piece of plastic by the fire hydrant, which is nowhere near the pieces of plastic where you were basing all of your calculations on. So, and that piece of plastic is the furthest away from John O'Keefe's body. So maybe you should have used that piece of plastic near the fire hydrant and not near the curb, which you used. All right, so he pointed that point out. Then also part of the questioning was that, is there any evidence? Do you have any evidence at all that John O'Keefe's body rolled over to the spot where he eventually landed, his final resting place? And he said that there's no evidence. There's no evidence at all that he rolled there, right? And he also said, is there any evidence that he flew through the air? And Trooper Paul said, no, there's no evidence of that. And then Alan Jackson said, exactly. There's no evidence of that. And of course, that elicited an objection. And the judge admonished him. And all right, continuing on. Now, he also asked him, he said, hold on a second. We know that according to your assessment here, your expert opinion, that John O'Keefe was hit by this car going backwards, somehow the drinking glass also flew around 30 feet to where its final resting place was near John O'Keefe, right? So he said, how did that happen? And his answer to that was, I don't know. I wasn't there. Now, he actually said that, I wasn't there. And I thought Alan Jackson was going to capitalize on that. Oh, you weren't there, and that's why you don't know, because you weren't there. And somehow you do know how his body ended up there, but you weren't there either for that. So how is it that you weren't there is a good enough answer to explain how the drinking glass ended up there? You have no explanation for that, but all of a sudden you do have an explanation for how John O'Keefe's body ended up there. Didn't you just say you weren't there? That was a good enough reason, and that's not going to be a good enough reason how you can't tell us that how John O'Keefe's body ended up there? But he didn't continue in that line, but he still continued with other ways. So another thing that he said was that, hold on a second, his cell phone, John O'Keefe's cell phone, was found tucked under his body. That was the verbiage that Alan Jackson used. So now you have the drinking glass, which you're saying he's holding in one hand, and you also have his cell phone, which also somehow flew through the air and just perfectly ended up right underneath John O'Keefe's body. How do you explain that? And his answer to this was, it just did. That's just how it ended up. You know, that's coincidence. The cell phone happened to have flown through the air the same way John O'Keefe somehow ended up there. And at the same exact point when John O'Keefe landed, or eventually at that resting place, that final resting place where he either rolled there or stumbled there or flew through the air there. It's not really clear how he ended up there, but somehow that's exactly where the same cell phone also ended up. And he said he had no explanation for that. He said it just did. And then also something which I thought was just so interesting. He said that that's just the evidence at the scene. I didn't put the evidence there. So here he's saying, I don't know. That's just how the evidence ended up at the scene. That's how the drinking glass ended up there. That's how the cell phone ended up there. That's how the piece of taillight ended up by the fire hydrant. That's just the evidence at the scene. I didn't put it there. I don't have any control over it. So that's what he was saying. But once he said that, I didn't put it there, Alan Jackson right away capitalized, that's right. You didn't put it there. Meaning, who did put it there? Obviously somebody else put it there. But he was pointing, that's right. You didn't put it there. But the obvious implication there. And that is exactly where the judge also stepped in right away. And there was an objection, and then there's an admonishment saying that he can't do that. And the judge tells Mr. Jackson, you can't do that. You can't just make comments like that. You can't make arguments in the middle of a witness, right? Witnesses are for questions and answers. And you want to save everything. You can save everything for closing argument. Then you can say whatever you want, essentially. So the judge right away jumped in and said, Mr. Jackson, don't do that again. And he said, I understand. And then she says, you always say that you understand, but now I'm telling you not to do it. So that's what, that was just a funny exchange there. All right. So he also brought out the fact that Trooper Paul was told by some other troopers that this was a pedestrian versus vehicle accident. I think maybe even Trooper Proctor told him that this was a pedestrian versus vehicle accident. And because it was that, they asked him to reconstruct it. So he was saying, do you understand what confirmation bias is? You were told that this happened a certain way. How can you now be objective and give us an objective opinion about how this happened? You were told to reconstruct the accident as though it is a vehicle versus pedestrian accident. So, of course, you're going to try to figure out a way how this all makes sense. But that doesn't mean that you're being objective. If you're being objective, they would say, these are all the pieces of evidence that we have. Let me know if you can figure out how any of this happened. But instead, you were told that this was a pedestrian versus vehicle accident. Then he also pointed out the fact that these scratches on the car that he testified earlier to was either because of the glass or because of the impact with John O'Keefe. Those scratches on the car could have been earlier than January 29th. You don't know that for sure that it was from this drinking glass. How do you know that it couldn't have been from before? There's also a point that he brought up, and he said he couldn't answer this question. Now, he also pointed out the fact that all of the calculations that were done, and this is also brought out earlier, which is why a lot of times you see that certain things are being established in the beginning of the trial, and you're not exactly sure why they're establishing those certain facts, but then in a later witness, you start to see how things come together. And one of the things that they were pointing out with the early witnesses is if they, when the officers were collecting evidence, if they made any sort of diagram exactly where the pieces of taillight were found, using coordinates like the flagpole, like the fire hydrant, like the curb, like the car. Why don't you use any of those coordinates to be able to map out exactly where you found these pieces of taillight and glass and these pieces of evidence? And they've all said, well, it was all generally around the same area. But actually, when it comes to accident reconstruction, this is very important. And therefore, this is why it came back. It came full circle when Alan Jackson was cross-examining Trooper Paul. And he said, so you don't know exactly where the body was. When you're measuring this 6'2" person, and you're trying to guess exactly where he ended up, his final resting place, and then you're making calculations all based on where his body was, and you don't even know where his body was. And nobody can even tell you exactly where it is. They're giving you a guess. They're giving you an estimate. And even the person that told you about it was Lieutenant Gallagher, who was not even at the scene. So this is like third-hand, fourth-hand information that you're hearing about exactly where the body was. And based on that, you're using this to reconstruct this accident. It's just a terrible way to do it. And therefore, he's saying, obviously, then your calculations can be all off. Now, here was also a very, very strong point for Alan Jackson, and I'm sure everyone's talking about this. And this is when it had to do with the key cycles. And what happened here was Trooper Paul testified that according to the data and everything like that, all this data that he was able to pull out in these reports, there's a key cycle which records every time you push that start and stop button, then there can create a key cycle, what they call a key cycle. And then there's a difference between whether the engine goes on or not. Okay, that just gets a little more complicated. But essentially, when you push that button, there's a key cycle. Okay, and the car records each time you push that button, each time you push the key cycle. Now, his testimony was that when Trooper Paul began to test, doing his own testing on Karen Reed's car, the key cycle was at 1,164. It was 1164. That's when he started the testing. And right before that, at 1162, that key cycle, that was when he was able to determine that Karen Reed's car moved up 60 feet, threw into reverse, went 24.2 miles per hour, then hit something and went down a half a mile per hour, and then continued a little bit. Okay, that's when all of this analysis was done at key cycle 1163, which is 2 key cycles before 1164. Now, Alan Jackson pointed out, this is just brilliant, he just pointed out the fact that if you think about all of the key cycles that had to have happened after this alleged accident, there was a number of times where there had to have been a key cycle. So, for example, when Karen Reed, the next morning, when she went to drive from John O'Keefe's house to Jennifer McCabe's house, that was a key cycle after this alleged accident, right? So that should be, I don't know, another number. And then there's also the driving from one Meadows Avenue to her parents' house. That's another key cycle. Then there's the car being driven onto the flatbed from her parents' house. And then it's driving off the flatbed into the Sallyport and Canton Police Department. Well, now you're already like 5 key cycles away from 1162. So it should really be, the key cycle should really be 1159. If what you're saying is true, that this all happened, that she threw the car into reverse, and this all happened 2 key cycles before you tested it, that doesn't make much sense. It should be at key cycle 1159. And yet you're only saying that you found that all this stuff to occur at key cycle 1162, which is only 2 key cycles before you tested this car, which would also suggest that who was in control of that vehicle at 1162, at key cycle 1162, at that point, Trooper Michael Proctor already had access and was in control of that car, which is again suggesting that he was the one to bring this car and do this whole setup, this whole frame up. That's essentially what you're reading between the lines here of what's going on. So that was just a brilliant point that he brought out on cross-examination. Now, also something that's important to know about that data, if you're looking over that data, that data actually, not every event is recorded on a key cycle. That report was only based on something what they call triggering events. Triggering events is when something odd happens to the car. So like a 3-point turn, or just something odd happens when you throw the car into reverse and go 24 miles per hour. So it's just not regular driving patterns. That's when that report was created. And there is no report at all for key cycle 1159, which is, according to the way Alan Jackson went through the different versions of events, the key cycle for when they pulled up the 34 Fairview was 1159, and there's no triggering events at that point. So a great point. And he even got him to admit, Trooper Paul to admit that Michael Proctor would have been, according to his hypothetical, he would have been the one in control of the car at key cycle 1162. Now, he also had some more fun with him, and this is when it came to showing how he's not really an expert and he doesn't really know much what he's talking about. He said, you were asked in the grand jury, can you calculate how far a body would move if it was struck by a vehicle? Right? That was one of the things that Trooper Paul was asked in the grand jury proceeding. And his answer was the following: yes, based on miles per hour, speed of the vehicle, striking vehicle, and stuff. So Alan Jackson right away was, what's this stuff that you're talking about? What do you mean by stuff? And his answer was, I don't know. And then he said, did you ever do the stuff that you're talking about? And he said, no. He said, we wouldn't be able to calculate that from this collision. Now, let's just put a pause for a second, okay? Any lawyer will tell you that when dealing with an expert, we never hear stuff, okay? That's not how experts talk. Whether it's a doctor expert or a biomechanical engineer expert, they don't say stuff. They may say factors. They may say there's other factors involved, but the other elements, they don't talk like stuff. They just don't say that stuff, okay? Maybe lawyers talk that way. Maybe police officers talk that way. But not experts, not expert witnesses when they're talking about physics, science, math. That's just not how they talk. So that was one point that he's bringing out, that you're talking about this stuff. So what is this stuff? He also said that he didn't know John O'Keefe's weight. And he said also that he's not able to calculate how far John O'Keefe's body would have went because it was a side swipe. So because it was a side swipe, he was not able to tell how much. So then he started getting into the equation. And this is when he started to actually feel a little bad for Trooper Paul, because he was giving him like a little test on some of these equations, which you're supposed to know about if you're doing accident reconstruction. So for example, he asked him about initial momentum. So there's a initial momentum equation, which is that momentum equals the mass times the velocity. It's P equals M times V, mass times velocity. And he asked him about that initial momentum equation. And he said, well, his answer to that was, you wouldn't use that for pedestrians. Okay, and Alan Jackson's response to that was, oh, you're telling me that pedestrians are magically out of the realm of physics? Like physics, this equation only works for other types of physics, like car versus car, but an individual, a pedestrian, all of a sudden this equation is not accurate anymore? And of course, that was hard to answer. And he said, well, there's a weight differential between the vehicle and pedestrian, which of course we all know, but Alan Jackson already made his point. And then he said, so to respond to that, Alan Jackson said, so if the vehicle is too heavy and the pedestrian is too light, you can't calculate the initial momentum of the vehicle? And then he said, no. So he said, so where'd you learn that? Like, what are you saying? Like, where did you learn that from? And his answer to that was math class. So it's just like, and then he tried to take it back. He said, well, okay, I didn't mean math class. I meant like my reconstruction course. But it's just when you don't have a real expert on the stand, you can kind of do this with them. And it makes him out to sound really silly. And that's exactly what Alan Jackson did. And he did it very effectively. And then he also asked him another question. He asked him, would you need to apply the conservation of momentum when calculating this data? Do you need to apply that equation? And his answer was yes. And then he said to him, okay, is the total momentum before the collision greater or less after the collision? Okay, so again, is the total momentum before the collision greater or less than after the collision? And his response to this was, what type of collision? Okay, which is essentially saying, well, it depends on the type of collision, right? I mean, what type of collision are we talking about? Talking about a pedestrian, we're talking about a vehicle versus vehicle. And then Alan Jackson responded to him. He said, Trooper Paul, they are exactly the same. They are exactly the same. Momentum doesn't change. That is the definition of the theory of conservation of momentum. Like, this is like the very basics. This is like the ABCs of like physics and science. So not only, he was pointing out to him, not only do you not know like the really hard stuff, like this is the basics. And you don't even know the basics. And that is the message that the jury was getting from Alan Jackson. And then he said, right, that's correct. That's correct. That they don't change. And then he said, well, why didn't you say that to the jurors the first time I asked you? So really just really bringing this out that Trooper Paul is just not an expert. And then he plays this game with him. He says, okay, let's try to reenact how you're saying this accident happened. So he said, okay, so let's play this out in the courtroom. Let me take my arm. You're saying that his arm was hit at what angle, and he was showing him how it's just patently ridiculous about what his theory is, that his arm, this is one of the things that he was saying. His arm, John O'Keefe's arm, got hit by the back of the vehicle, right, by the taillight. Now, the taillight wasn't broken yet. The taillight was not broken. It could have become broken after it hit John O'Keefe, but at first impact, it wasn't broken. And then you're saying that because his arm stayed on that taillight, that's what caused these abrasions to happen from the taillight. So it wasn't just like a boom and then he's out. It was a collision, and then his arm stays on the vehicle long enough to create these abrasions. And then after it's on long enough to create the abrasions, it spins him around. Somehow his head smashes into the curb. And then he also lands, who knows how many feet away from the curb, either flying through the air or rolling on the grass. So just by playing out exactly what his theory is, it just makes it sound ridiculous. And that's what he's doing. That's what Alan Jackson was doing with this witness. And they said, how do you account for the fact that he didn't have any broken bones? This is a car going 24 miles per hour, just smashes into the person's arm, his upper arm, and it just causes some abrasions, doesn't cause any broken bones. He says he can't. And then he said he can't account for that. So then essentially Alan Jackson, he does this a lot before he sits down. He just says certain questions which he knows the answer is going to be no to, but he still does it anyway. He says, really, you came to these conclusions because Trooper Michael Proctor told you to come to these conclusions, right? And even though you understand that this makes no sense, you're still doing it because this is what Michael Proctor asked you to do. And that's why you're getting up here and saying these ridiculous things to the jury. And you're just trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. And he sat down. And really, he just did such a great job. It's worthwhile rewatching his cross-examination because he did really a good job. All right, so on redirect, he tried to rehabilitate a little bit, saying that there's no other witnesses. There's multiple witnesses that said that Karen Reed did that three-point turn, and there's no other data in the car which shows that any three-point turn was done at any other time. So that three-point turn was done right before the data says that the car was thrown into reverse. It was 8 minutes before the car was thrown into reverse. And there's no other data showing that there's any other three-point turn that was done. So that would suggest that since there's so many witnesses, multiple witnesses, unless you buy the whole conspiracy theory, if there's so many witnesses that say that Karen Reed was the one who did this three-point turn, then it would also make sense that she was the one who threw the car into reverse and not under any of this conspiracy theory that Trooper Michael Proctor did it on his own to frame her. All right, and then he also tried to get out of that not everything was based on the key cycles. Remember that very strong point that Alan Jackson brought out about the key cycles. So then he tried to take that back and say, well, it's not just based on the key cycles. It's also based on the odometer mileage that he was also basing all this on. It's not just key cycles. And then on recross, Alan Jackson brought up, well, hold on a second. Friday you said it was all about key cycles. And then all of a sudden now on the stand, you're trying to change your story a little bit, aren't you? So is that because you didn't want me, you knew I was going to ask you questions about it, and therefore now you don't want to tell me this before on Friday, you don't want to say this, all of a sudden you're saying this now. So again, he made some points there. All right, so that was really the Trooper Paul's testimony and his cross-examination, and certainly very interesting, educational, and exciting and fun to watch, entertaining. All right, then we get on to Ian Whiffen. Ian Whiffen is a decoding product manager at Celebrite. And you're having all these witnesses come in, and they have to explain why on Jennifer McCabe's phone, the Celebrite report comes back that a 227 search was done, Haas long to die in cold, and deleted. So that looks really, really bad for the Commonwealth. If you're on the Commonwealth side, you've got to be able to explain that away. So now this is the second witness, and there's going to be 3 in total so far. We already had the first witness, Jessica Hyde, I think her name was, right? She came in and she explained how this all happens and why that the search really wasn't done then, and it really wasn't deleted. And they're all explaining SQLs and walls and getting into all the technicals of how all this stuff works. And here we had Ian Whiffen as well, who is a decoding product manager, very, very intelligent. All these people are very smart. And he is also there. He spent a lot of time. Essentially, what his testimony came down to was explaining that this Google search that Jennifer McCabe did at 227 was not Haas long to die in cold. It wasn't done at 227. It was done at 623. And there's no records that she deleted anything. There are things that get deleted by its own, the system. If you understand how all this works, you'd understand that really it's not the user deleting it, and he made that very clear. Okay, essentially, that was essentially what his testimony was. Now, in cross-examination, was brought out that the fact that he just tested in iOS 15.82, and really Jennifer McCabe's phone was a 15.21. So there's a big change between the iOS 14s, and once you got into the 15s, there's a difference in how all this data and storage was used, and deletions and all these things. So it really, there was a big change when iOS 15, and that's why he went on explaining about that. But still, this was Yannetti doing the cross-examination, pointing out that he actually did not test the exact system of Jennifer McCabe. Okay, then he also pointed out this last point was that isn't it possible that someone can make it look like someone can go and take the extraction and alter it and then make it look like it wasn't extracted. I mean, essentially trying to show that really Trooper Michael Proctor could have done this on his own, and there's something called MySQL, which you can start playing around with these things. And his answer to this was, Ian Whiffen, his answer was that technically it could be done, but you need a large amount of knowledge and skill, meaning this would not be able to be done by a regular police officer or a regular layman who doesn't know the intricacies of how all these systems work. That was essentially his testimony. So that was the second expert witness explaining to us how Jennifer McCabe's search at 227 was not Haas long to die in cold, and she did not delete that search. Then we had Trooper Nicholas Garino. And he testified also that this defense's expert, and they're going to have a defense is going to have some expert who they're all tearing apart right now. The Commonwealth's experts are tearing apart now, saying, oh, he got everything wrong about Jennifer McCabe doing this search at 2:27 in the morning. And he also, obviously, he's on the Commonwealth side. He's saying that he also agrees that Jennifer McCabe did not do the search at 2:27 and was not deleted. So here you got the third witness testifying about that as well. And then you have the text messages. So we just got into the text messages before the end of the day today, and those were text messages between Karen Reed and John O'Keefe on January 28th. Now, it's very clear from the text messages. We don't have to read all of them, but the point is that it's very clear that they got into a fight January 28th in the morning. It's not clear from the text messages just yet what the fight was about, and that was something that I was wondering about. There was some sort of fight January 20th, or disagreement, January 28th in the morning between John O'Keefe and Karen Reed. And Karen was very upset about it. And they were texting about it. Now, was this about the Aruba incident? I don't know, because it's already 28 days later, or many days later. So are they continuing to argue about what happened in Aruba, or is this a new fight? And it does seem from the text messages from John O'Keefe, one of the things that he said in the text messages is that we've been fighting like this for weeks. We keep getting into fights. Our relationship is just one big fight, and I'm tired of it. So that's essentially what he was saying. And in fact, in some of the text messages, she was saying, if you're done with me, if you want to leave me for somebody else, that's fine. If you're not into the whole relationship, that's fine. And he didn't even say that. What he said was, I'm not interested in all these fights. I don't want to constantly have a fight with you. Let's have a normal relationship and not have fights. So that's essentially what the back and forth was. And she kept saying to him, if you want to leave me, then just say the word. I'll give you all the space that you want. And he was not taking that bait at all. He wasn't saying that he wants her to leave. It just seems that he was fed up with how much they're fighting, and he wants them to stop fighting. That's essentially what the fights were about. But there's something that happened January 28th in the morning. Again, another fight seemed to have happened in the morning, and Karen Reed seemed to be very upset about it. And that's what she kept texting him about. After the way you treated me, you're setting me up to fail. And she was very, very beside herself, very upset about that whole interaction that morning. And she kept texting him. He texted back a little bit, and she also was calling him consistently, calling him constantly, trying to get him to talk on the phone, and he wasn't interested. He just wasn't interested. And maybe it was because he wasn't interested in talking in that state. Maybe he just wanted things to cool down a little bit before they actually talk about it, but he wasn't interested. So she kept calling him. She called him something like 18 times. 11 times the call was rejected. 4 times it was missed, meaning he just let it ring. And he actually answered 3 times. Maybe when he answered the phone, he said, I don't want to talk about this now. Okay, we're going to talk about this later. It's possible that's what he said. I don't know what he said. But he did answer the phone 3 times. But here you have her just reaching out, trying to call him, trying to speak about the relationship, obviously very upset about what happened that morning, and he's not interested. He just doesn't want to talk about it. He did call back at some point at 3 p.m. All right. Then finally, at the end of the night, the last text message that we saw was the 12:55 a.m. text message that she writes, I'm going home. Then she writes, see you later. Then she writes, later. Again, these are all text messages after 12:55. Your kids are cucking alone, which seems to have been a typo. Then I'm back in Mansfield. The kids are home alone. So texting John O'Keefe, she keeps texting him that night as if he's still alive, as if she didn't actually intend or try to kill him then. So that was the end of the text message today. That was the end of the day today. So tomorrow there's not going to be a day of trial in front of the jury. There is going to be a full day, or however long it takes for them, seems to be doing voir dire on some of the defense's proposed experts. That's what seems to be happening. And then Wednesday is going to be a holiday, so we're going to pick up the trial again in front of the jury, at least on Thursday and Friday. Again, hopefully this case is going to wrap up sometime soon, with the judges hoping that it's going to be done by the end of June. Well, that's it for now. Thank you for listening. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, like, and we will see you next time.